When we talk about history, it's tempting to take for granted what's been written down. Names, events, stories, they all seem solid, like bricks in a wall that has stood for thousands of years. But the deeper you look, the more that wall starts to look like it's built from sand. One of the most intriguing questions in history is whether a man named Jesus, whose life changed the course of millions, actually existed at all. Most people assume that Jesus is a historical fact. We see references to him everywhere, in books, in movies, in holidays that dictate public life. But when we strip away centuries of religious tradition, ritual, and storytelling, what remains? Surprisingly little. The earliest texts that mention Jesus were written decades after the events they describe. The Gospels, the main source of his life story, were composed between 30 and 60 years after the supposed crucifixion. That's a long time for stories to evolve, for myths to creep into memory. Human memory is notoriously unreliable, especially when it's collective and oral, passed from one group to another over decades. Even the so-called contemporary sources are tenuous. Tacitus, a Roman historian, mentions Jesus, but only indirectly. He writes about Christians being punished under Emperor Nero and refers to a Christus who suffered under Pontius Pilate. Yet Tacitus was born decades after Jesus' supposed death. He wasn't an eyewitness, and his account could have been based on hearsay or earlier Christian writings he had access to. Josephus, another key reference, contains a passage that describes Jesus, but most scholars agree that it was at least partially altered by later Christian editors. The more we look, the more the historical foundation appears shaky. Consider the letters of Paul. Paul is often cited as the earliest written evidence for Jesus, predating the Gospels by decades. But here's the catch. Paul rarely talks about Jesus' life. He focuses almost entirely on theology, faith, and mystical experiences. He never describes Jesus performing miracles, teaching crowds, or being crucified in a concrete historical sense. For a man central to Paul's letters, Jesus appears strangely absent from the tangible details we would expect if he were an actual historical person. This raises a fascinating point about how humans create belief. Cultures often construct stories around powerful archetypes, figures who embody ideals, fears, and aspirations. Jesus fits neatly into a long line of mythic saviors. Across history, countless societies have imagined divine or semi-divine figures who teach morality, suffer for others, and inspire devotion. The story of Jesus could have been born in much the same way, emerging from a mixture of Jewish messianic expectations, allegorical storytelling, and the human desire for moral heroes. The earliest Christian communities didn't see themselves as documenting history. They were shaping belief. They needed a figure to rally around, someone whose story justified their ethical and spiritual visions. In an era without mass media or fact-checking, oral traditions could become reality to a community long before they were written down. And once stories are written, they gain the weight of authority. Over time, the line between myth and memory blurs. Even the historical context of first-century Judea gives us reasons to question a literal Jesus. It was a period brimming with religious ferment. Messianic figures appeared regularly, each promising salvation, liberation, or prophetic truth. The Roman Empire was vast, and rebellions were common. It's statistically probable that stories of miracle workers and teachers would arise naturally. One could emerge not as a single historical individual, but as a composite of several figures, combined and polished by retelling. Archaeology and contemporaneous records tell us something else. Unlike major political figures of the time, emperors, governors, generals, Jesus leaves no direct footprint, no coins, no inscriptions, no court records. We have no Roman or Jewish documents that confirm his actions, despite the fact that crucifixion was a public and recorded form of execution. This absence is not proof that he didn't exist, but it's a glaring gap when compared to other figures who lived under the same conditions. It's a gap that historians cannot ignore. Some argue that the lack of evidence is irrelevant because Jesus was a minor figure in his own time, whose importance only grew after his death. But even minor figures in highly literate societies tend to leave some trace. If we expect letters, mentions, or artifacts from hundreds of ordinary people, it's curious that a man whose death supposedly sparked mass movements leaves nothing outside the writings of devoted followers decades later. It's also worth noting how the Gospels themselves are contradictory. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John offer different chronologies, teachings, and miracles. They disagree on where he was born, what he said, and how he died. These contradictions suggest that the stories were shaped by theological priorities rather than by historical fact. The Gospels are, in many ways, less a biography and more a manifesto for belief designed to inspire and guide rather than record reality. Human psychology plays a big role in why such stories persist. People naturally seek patterns, meaning, and moral order. We are prone to see intention where there is randomness, agency where there is none. A compelling story about a miraculous figure who suffers, forgives, and inspires can embed itself deeply in a culture. Over generations, belief transforms into assumed fact, and questioning it becomes socially and culturally challenging. Even within the Gospels, many of the most famous stories feel like literary construction rather than eyewitness testimony. The virgin birth, the walking on water, the resurrection. They follow patterns found in countless earlier myths. Ancient cultures love to elevate extraordinary figures with miraculous origins and impossible feats. Horus in Egypt, Mithras in Persia, Dionysus in Greece, they all share elements echoed in the story of Jesus. These similarities don't prove that Jesus didn't exist, but they do suggest that the story we know is at least partially shaped by mythic conventions. The resurrection in particular is central. It's supposed to be the defining proof of Jesus' divinity. Yet when we look closely, it relies on subjective experiences, visions, dreams, and spiritual encounters reported by a small group of believers. None of these experiences were documented in real time, and none can be independently verified. Psychological studies show that people are remarkably prone to genuine-sounding hallucinations and collective belief, especially when grief, hope, and expectation are involved. A vision of a risen figure can feel more real than almost anything else. Even if some historical figure existed as a teacher or wandering preacher, the figure presented in the Gospels is almost certainly a combination of local messianic expectations, oral storytelling, and theological interpretation. Consider how communities embellish their founders. Leaders, even minor ones, become symbols of ideals. Over decades, stories accumulate. Performances of virtue, miraculous events, prophetic sayings, all designed to make the figure larger than life. By the time the Gospels are written, it's hard to separate history from legend. There's another piece often overlooked: the silence of contemporary observers. Rome was meticulous in documenting revolts, uprisings, and public punishments. The Jewish historian Josephus, though sometimes referenced, provides only brief mentions, and those are contested. Other Roman writers of the period, like Pliny or Suetonius, make no mention of him. When you compare this to figures of comparable influence, or even lesser influence, the silence is striking. If someone truly sparked a movement that challenged religious authorities and ended with execution under Roman law, you would expect more than a handful of decades later references. We also see how the story of Jesus conveniently aligns with Jewish expectations of the Messiah, yet reinterprets them to create a uniquely universal appeal. He's a suffering servant rather than a political liberator, a teacher of love rather than a warrior king. This transformation suggests a deliberate reshaping of messianic ideas to serve a new religious vision rather than a faithful recording of actual events. The more we examine the text critically, the more it seems the figure of Jesus was designed as much as he was remembered. Sociologically, Christianity had every reason to craft a compelling narrative. Early followers were a small, often persecuted minority. They needed stories that could unify, inspire, and sustain them. Miracles, moral teachings, and divine validation provided a framework for community cohesion. A vivid story of a martyr who defied death offers a powerful anchor for belief. Over time, these stories were polished, edited, and codified. By the time Christianity became institutionalized, the myth had hardened into what most people now accept as historical fact. Even the letters of Paul illustrate this process. He emphasizes Jesus' death and resurrection as central, but the details of Jesus' life, the kind of things we would expect from historical records, are largely absent. Paul writes to guide communities in belief and practice, not to document a biography. This is exactly what you would expect if the movement was shaped more by collective storytelling and theological need than by a literal historical figure. The human brain is wired to create patterns and meaning. Once a compelling story emerges, it can spread rapidly, especially in oral cultures. Psychological studies on memory transmission show that stories become more coherent and morally satisfying as they pass from person to person, even when details are inaccurate. This is called cultural evolution. Stories survive not because they're factual, but because they resonate, inspire, and serve social purposes. In this light, the story of Jesus looks very much like a story shaped for survival rather than a strictly accurate historical account. Consider how Christianity incorporated existing cultural elements. Festivals, rituals, and symbols often parallel pre-existing traditions. Christmas aligns closely with midwinter celebrations. Easter resonates with older spring fertility rites. Jesus' life story, miracles, and teachings echo motifs found in older myths. This blending is not unusual. Religions evolve through assimilation, and over centuries, original details become obscured. The Jesus we read about today is therefore a product of centuries of storytelling, cultural adaptation, and ideological shaping. Even modern historians acknowledge this tension. Some accept a historical Jesus as a teacher who likely lived in Galilee, but the closer you look at the actual historical evidence, the murkier it becomes. There is no contemporary documentation that meets standard criteria for historical certainty. Much of what we take as evidence is filtered through decades of theological interpretation. The further removed we are from the events, the more the line between myth and reality blurs. We can also examine the human desire for meaning in suffering. Stories of a compassionate, suffering figure provide a psychological anchor for understanding injustice and hardship. They reassure communities that pain is meaningful, that there is a moral arc to history. In first-century Judea, under Roman occupation, this would have been particularly potent. Whether or not a historical Jesus existed, the story fulfilled a deep need, a need that likely drove the narrative forward more than any single individual did. Finally, looking at history comparatively, it's clear that Christianity's success is not proof of historical accuracy. Many religions with no historical founder have thrived, and many historical figures have faded into obscurity. Survival and influence depend more on narrative power, social utility, and cultural adoption than on the factuality of the central figure. From this perspective, Jesus functions as a powerful archetype, whether or not he was ever a person who walked the earth. When we examine the Gospels closely, another striking feature emerges: the inconsistencies. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John often tell the same events in entirely different ways. The Nativity story, for example, changes dramatically between Matthew and Luke. Different locations, different people, even different timing. Sometimes Jesus' words and deeds vary, even contradict, depending on which gospel you read. These differences aren't minor. They reveal that the stories were not carefully recorded history, but narratives shaped by different communities with different theological priorities. Even the chronology of Jesus' life is problematic. The Gospels offer conflicting accounts of the sequence of events: when he arrived in Jerusalem, the order of miracles, even the timing of his crucifixion. Historical reconstruction becomes difficult when basic details are inconsistent. Scholars have spent centuries trying to reconcile these contradictions, but no fully coherent timeline emerges. This is exactly what you would expect if the stories were constructed from oral traditions, theological agendas, and cultural expectations rather than first-hand documentation of actual events. Another subtle clue comes from the nature of the miracles themselves. Many resemble symbolic or allegorical motifs common in other religious stories. Healing the blind, walking on water, raising the dead. These are not unique to Christianity. Similar tales appear in Egyptian, Greek, and Mesopotamian myths. The human mind seems drawn to narratives that combine extraordinary feats with moral lessons, and ancient storytellers often use these elements to teach and inspire. The repetition of these motifs suggests that the stories of Jesus were crafted to resonate with existing cultural frameworks, not to record verifiable history. The letters of Paul provide another intriguing point. Paul never met Jesus in life. His encounters were visionary, spiritual experiences. He sees a resurrected figure in a vision on the road to Damascus. This is the moment that transforms him, and it becomes the cornerstone of his letters. From a historical perspective, this is fascinating. The foundation of the Christian movement rests not on empirical observation, but on a subjective spiritual experience. In other words, the movement begins with belief, and history is written to support that belief. We can also look at the sociological forces that shaped the spread of Christianity. In a vast empire, ideas traveled slowly and relied on communal reinforcement. A compelling story of a charismatic teacher who dies for a cause provides a rallying point for groups that are otherwise powerless. Early Christians were marginalized, facing persecution from both Roman authorities and Jewish leaders. Their survival depended on cohesion and shared narrative. A miraculous founder who embodied moral ideals gave communities a sense of purpose and legitimacy. Over time, this story hardened into the gospel accounts we read today. Interestingly, some scholars suggest that Christianity borrowed extensively from other contemporary religious movements. Mystery religions in the Roman world offered secret knowledge, salvation, and death and resurrection narratives. The parallels are striking. Followers of these religions believed in divine or semi-divine figures who suffered, died, and were reborn. Jesus fits comfortably into this pattern, suggesting that the story may have been influenced by broader religious trends rather than historical events alone. Even small details in the Gospels reveal signs of narrative construction. The Sermon on the Mount, for instance, presents an idealized set of moral teachings that reflect the concerns of later communities as much as the life of any historical figure. Many sayings attributed to Jesus are difficult to verify historically. Scholars often debate whether they reflect an actual teacher or were written to convey ethical principles to a developing community. The result is a portrait that blends history, philosophy, and theological aspiration into a single narrative. Psychologically, the story of Jesus addresses universal human concerns: mortality, morality, and meaning. Humans are wired to find patterns, to seek explanations for suffering, and to imagine justice beyond the material world. A narrative that personifies virtue, suffering, and redemption taps into deep cognitive and emotional structures. From this perspective, it's not surprising that the story of Jesus gained traction and endured. It satisfies a psychological need as much as a historical curiosity. The development of the Gospels also highlights how oral cultures transform memory into myth. Before writing became widespread, stories circulated orally, shaped by the collective imagination. Memory is reconstructive. It changes with each retelling. Details that were inconvenient, confusing, or unremarkable were altered or omitted. Those that reinforced moral or spiritual lessons were amplified. By the time these stories were committed to writing, they bore the marks of decades of cultural evolution rather than precise recollection. We can also examine the political dimensions. Early Christianity emerged in a time of social tension and oppression. Roman occupation of Judea created fertile ground for messianic expectations. Stories of a humble, suffering savior provided both hope and moral guidance. Later, as Christianity spread across the empire, the narrative was adapted to appeal to diverse audiences, reinforcing its universality and making it resilient. Historical accuracy was secondary to the story's capacity to unify and inspire. The absence of contemporary corroboration is a crucial point. For a figure whose death supposedly sparked a movement that transformed the world, there is remarkably little independent evidence from the time. Tacitus, Josephus, and other sources are distant, incomplete, or disputed. This absence raises a serious question. If Jesus truly existed as described, why would he leave so few traces in the historical record? Compared to other religious or political figures of the same era, the silence is notable. Even the crucifixion, the event central to Christian theology, is difficult to verify historically. Roman records of executions were typically kept, yet we rely almost entirely on gospel narratives. These accounts were written to emphasize theological meaning, the suffering, sacrifice, and redemption of Jesus, rather than to document a legal proceeding. From a historian's perspective, this is highly unusual and suggests that the crucifixion may have been more symbolic than strictly factual. As Christianity developed, the figure of Jesus became increasingly elaborated. Early communities emphasized different aspects depending on their needs. Some highlighted his moral teachings, others his miracles, still others his death and resurrection. Over time, these emphases were codified into the gospel texts we have today. The process resembles cultural evolution. Ideas that resonate and survive are preserved, while those that fail to inspire are discarded. This explains why the Gospels are internally inconsistent yet share overarching themes. The role of martyrdom is particularly important. Stories of Jesus' suffering and death provided a template for early followers, many of whom faced persecution themselves. A narrative in which the founder endures injustice, forgives oppressors, and triumphs spiritually offers both a model and reassurance. Martyrdom narratives exist in many cultures, yet they rarely correspond to exact historical events. They serve a social function, uniting communities, inspiring devotion, and legitimizing belief. The story of Jesus' crucifixion fits neatly into this pattern. It's also striking how the Gospels reshape Jewish expectations. The Messiah in Jewish tradition was anticipated as a liberator, often a political or military figure. The Jesus presented in the Gospels, however, is a spiritual savior who transcends earthly concerns. This transformation suggests deliberate construction, molding existing expectations to create a universal figure. By emphasizing humility, compassion, and spiritual authority, early Christians created a narrative designed to appeal broadly, rather than strictly recording the actions of a single historical person. There are subtle textual clues that hint at mythic construction. Parables, for example, are often extended allegories rather than concrete historical events. Miracles sometimes follow literary patterns found in other religious texts. Even the resurrection narratives, which differ across Gospels, contain symbolic elements: appearances in closed rooms, sudden transformations, and visions rather than verifiable physical proof. The patterns suggest storytelling shaped by theological and pedagogical aims, not eyewitness documentation. The psychology behind belief formation also explains why the story of Jesus persists so powerfully. Humans are predisposed to perceive intentionality. Even where none exists, we seek moral order, pattern, and meaning. Stories that offer resolution and hope are more likely to endure. Collective memory tends to solidify around figures who exemplify ideals. In this sense, Jesus functions as a cultural construct, a symbol around which communities can organize belief and behavior. One of the most under-discussed aspects is how communities shape memory. Anthropological research shows that stories shared orally evolve in predictable ways. Details that are vivid or morally significant are emphasized. Confusing or contradictory elements are simplified or harmonized. Over time, this leads to narratives that feel coherent and historically plausible, even if their origins are mythic or composite. The Gospels bear the fingerprints of this process, reflecting decades of communal shaping before being written down. Consider the parallels in other religions. Figures who die and return, who suffer for others, or who teach moral truth appear throughout history. These archetypes are not bound to a single historical instance. They recur across cultures and time periods. The story of Jesus fits into this broader pattern, suggesting that the narrative is part of a recurring human fascination with moral and spiritual heroes, rather than proof of a specific historical life. Even when we look at non-canonical texts, apocryphal gospels, lost letters, and early Christian writings, they paint a picture of a diverse, fluid tradition. Different communities had different understandings of Jesus. Some emphasized wisdom, others power, others mystical ascent. The lack of consistency supports the idea that the historical record, if it exists, has been overwhelmed by mythic and theological shaping. The Jesus most people know today is a crystallization of centuries of storytelling and ideological refinement. The cultural impact of Jesus does not depend on his historicity. Christianity flourished because the story was compelling, not because it was verified. Societies adopt and transmit narratives that serve social, moral, or psychological purposes. A figure who embodies virtue, suffering, and hope is an effective vessel for cultural continuity. Over centuries, the distinction between historical fact and narrative utility becomes blurred. What matters is not what really happened, but how the story functions within society. Another overlooked point is the lack of contemporaneous corroboration outside of Christian circles. The Roman Empire documented significant events meticulously: wars, executions, rebellions. A figure whose death allegedly sparked a religious movement would presumably appear in some official record. Yet outside of a few disputed references decades later, there is silence. This absence is not proof of non-existence, but it raises serious questions about the historical certainty of Jesus as a literal figure. Even the development of Christian rituals underscores mythic construction. Communion, baptism, and festivals often have roots in older practices. They were adapted to reinforce the narrative and theological claims. The story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is inseparable from the practices that commemorate it. Together, story and ritual form a cohesive cultural system, one that thrives on memory, symbol, and belief rather than empirical verification. Finally, the very endurance of the story highlights a human tendency to conflate narrative power with factual truth. Over millennia, compelling stories become accepted as history. Generations inherit beliefs not because they are historically verifiable, but because they resonate deeply, are reinforced socially, and provide meaning. The story of Jesus illustrates this process beautifully. It is a narrative that fulfills psychological, moral, and social needs, whether or not it corresponds to a single historical life. As we move forward in time, it becomes clear how the figure of Jesus was continually reshaped to meet the needs of evolving communities. The earliest followers lived in a volatile social and political environment. Judea under Roman rule was a crucible of unrest, messianic expectation, and religious experimentation. Small groups of believers needed a unifying figure, one who could embody both moral authority and spiritual salvation. Stories of Jesus' teachings, miracles, and resurrection were tailored to provide cohesion, hope, and legitimacy. The process of mythic embellishment is subtle but cumulative. Early accounts were likely brief and focused on moral or theological points. Over decades, additional episodes were inserted, dialogues expanded, and miracles amplified. Each community added layers that reflected its concerns. Some emphasized wisdom and ethical conduct, others divine power or suffering. By the time the Gospels were compiled, these layers had merged into a complex narrative that presents a single, coherent, but historically uncertain figure. It's instructive to compare Jesus to other historical figures who became mythologized. Alexander the Great, for instance, inspired legends of divine parentage and miraculous feats. Over time, the line between the historical conqueror and the mythic hero blurred. Similarly, the story of Jesus can be understood as a combination of sparse historical kernels, messianic expectations, and decades of myth-making. Distinguishing between what may have been real and what was added to inspire, teach, or unify is inherently difficult. Even the Gospel's most famous miracles fit familiar patterns. Healing the sick, raising the dead, walking on water. These motifs echo older myths and serve symbolic functions. They reinforce themes of moral authority, divine favor, and transcendence. Viewed through this lens, the miracles are less historical reportage and more narrative devices designed to communicate ideals. The emphasis is on meaning rather than verifiable fact. The resurrection narratives illustrate this vividly. Each gospel presents a different version, appearances to different people in different locations, sometimes with supernatural phenomena like angels or sudden transformations. These variations highlight that the story was shaped by theological needs rather than historical observation. Visionary experiences, dreams, and collective memory created a sense of reality for early believers, but they leave no empirical trace. Psychological research confirms that people can experience deeply convincing visions that feel entirely real, especially in heightened emotional states. Sociology helps explain why these narratives took hold so effectively. Communities under stress, oppression, or marginalization often adopt stories that provide hope and purpose. A founder who suffers, dies, and transcends death provides a model for resilience and moral conduct. Such narratives solidify identity, establish ethical norms, and inspire commitment. In this sense, the story of Jesus can be seen as a functional social creation. It helped bind early Christians together and sustain belief despite external pressures. Even the letters of Paul, the earliest Christian writings, offer clues. Paul emphasizes theological significance over biographical detail. The crucifixion and resurrection are central, but there is little attention to the specifics of Jesus' earthly life. This suggests that the figure of Jesus may have been more conceptual than historical for early followers. The theological message mattered more than factual recounting, which aligns with how mythic and symbolic figures function in other religions and cultures. The Gospels also reveal patterns consistent with oral transmission. Stories become more coherent, morally satisfying, and symbolically rich over repeated tellings. In this process, historical accuracy often diminishes. Scholars refer to this as creative memory or narrative evolution. The Jesus of the Gospels is therefore likely a blend of historical memory, theological reflection, and cultural storytelling, a figure constructed to meet the spiritual and social needs of communities rather than to provide a documentary record. The evolution of festivals and rituals further reinforces this. Holidays like Christmas and Easter absorb pre-existing traditions, aligning symbolic events with natural cycles and older cultural celebrations. Communion, baptism, and other rites codify theological claims and reinforce the narrative. Rituals both preserve and embellish the story of Jesus, ensuring that the myth continues to function effectively across generations. The integration of story and practice demonstrates how cultural and psychological forces shape religious memory. Even minor textual contradictions in the Gospels are telling. Differences in genealogy, geography, and chronology suggest multiple layers of construction rather than unified historical reporting. Some scholars argue these contradictions indicate that the authors were more concerned with conveying theological meaning than historical fact. If the goal was simply to record events, one would expect careful harmonization. The inconsistencies point to a narrative process shaped by human priorities, biases, and interpretive frameworks. Looking at comparative religion, we see similar patterns. Figures who die, return, or impart moral wisdom are common across cultures. Horus, Mithras, and Dionysus, among others, all exhibit elements echoed in the story of Jesus. This recurrence indicates that the human mind gravitates towards certain archetypes. Stories that resonate deeply are likely to be adopted, adapted, and elaborated upon. The parallels suggest that the Jesus narrative may have been influenced by, or at least fits comfortably within, broader mythic conventions rather than emerging solely from unique historical events. The endurance of the story is also a product of cognitive reinforcement. Humans remember and transmit narratives that are emotionally engaging, morally instructive, and socially useful. Once a story like Jesus emerges, it becomes self-reinforcing. It guides behavior, justifies belief, and structures community life. In this sense, the historical accuracy of the figure is secondary to the story's effectiveness as a cultural and psychological tool. Finally, modern scholarship increasingly recognizes the difficulty of separating history from myth in ancient religious texts. Some historians acknowledge a historical Jesus might have existed in some form, a wandering preacher or teacher in Galilee. But the evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and filtered through decades of narrative construction. The Jesus known to billions today is as much a product of cultural evolution, collective memory, and theological elaboration as he is a historical individual. This perspective encourages critical thinking, careful analysis, and a recognition that human belief often outpaces empirical verification. Some people argue that the strongest evidence for Jesus is the sincerity of early believers, as if being convinced makes something true. But conviction doesn't tell us whether the story began with a real person or with a narrative that grew until it felt real to the people repeating it. Human beings can believe almost anything if the story is emotionally charged, socially reinforced, and tied to identity. That doesn't make those stories historical, it makes them powerful. When we look at what motivates people to treat a story as history, it's rarely the evidence itself, it's the meaning behind it. A story that comforts, explains suffering, creates community, and promises justice is going to survive and spread whether it's historically accurate or not. And the earliest Christian texts are doing exactly that, offering meaning, not memories. Every time we peel back another layer, we find theological messaging instead of eyewitness detail, symbolic imagery instead of plain reporting. The earliest sources sound like people interpreting visions, meditating on scriptures, and trying to make sense of a world they felt was collapsing. They talk about cosmic battles, spiritual revelations, hidden mysteries revealed in dreams and prophecies. Those are not the tools you use when describing a real person you knew. Those are the tools you use when creating a figure who embodies an idea. Some argue that the moral teachings attributed to Jesus prove he must have existed. But moral sayings are the easiest thing in the world to attach to a fictional teacher. People still put quotes on the internet and attribute them to Einstein, Gandhi, or Buddha. And we have global communication, copyright, and decades of recordings. In the ancient world, attaching a teaching to a famous figure wasn't dishonest. It was normal. It was how you gave your ideas weight. If a community wanted its values to survive, tying them to a heroic character gave those values authority. Even the idea of a wise moral teacher isn't unique. Jewish tradition was full of wandering sages, fiery prophets, and end-times preachers. Greek culture had miracle workers, philosophers, and healers who attracted small crowds and left behind collections of sayings. Every culture had charismatic figures who mixed ethics with spiritual messages. Creating another one, especially one who blended traits from existing heroes, wasn't a stretch at all. Some defenders of historicity say the execution story is too embarrassing to invent. But this assumes the earliest storytellers were trying to make Jesus appealing to outsiders. In reality, they were speaking to people already expecting a suffering figure, a rejected prophet, a righteous man oppressed by the powerful. The story matches older patterns perfectly. It doesn't clash with ancient expectations, it fulfills them, which means it could easily have been shaped around those expectations rather than derived from a real event. The more we study ancient religions, the more we see this same pattern. A symbolic figure becomes a moral example, then a divine savior, then a historical person. It's a progression that relies on emotional need more than documented fact. And once a community builds rituals around the story, the question of did this actually happen becomes less important than what does this mean to us now? It's also important to consider how little effort ancient writers put into verifying sources. Letters circulated by hand, stories were repeated orally long before they were written down. Different groups edited, expanded, and reinterpreted the stories to align with their own beliefs. This wasn't fraud, it was the normal process of ancient storytelling. Accuracy was less important than purpose. The goal wasn't to record history, it was to affirm identity. If Jesus never existed, that doesn't undermine the social influence of Christianity. Movements don't need historical founders to reshape culture. Some of the most powerful religions and myths in history grew out of stories, not people. And even when historical figures existed, the legends around them quickly overshadow whatever the real person was like. So the question of Jesus' existence is not about disrespecting anyone's tradition. It's about understanding how ideas develop and why some stories survive while others vanish. One thing that gets overlooked is how early Christians disagreed sharply about who Jesus was. Not just small disagreements, entirely different versions of the character, the message, and the role he played. Some saw him as a heavenly being who never walked the earth. Some saw him as a purely spiritual presence. Some saw him as a human prophet adopted by God. Some saw him as an eternal divine being, appearing in human form. This diversity isn't what you get from people describing a real man they all knew. It's what you get from communities interpreting a figure who was already symbolic. If you listen closely to these texts, you can hear the authors pulling Jesus in different directions to fit their own worldviews. It's as if the character was a blank canvas and each group painted their own version on top of it. A historical person can be interpreted differently, sure, but not this differently. Not to the point where one group says he was born of a virgin in Bethlehem, another says he never had a physical body, another says he was adopted by God later in life, and another says he was eternal and had no beginning at all. That level of disagreement suggests the story did not begin with a shared memory. When a figure starts as a theological idea, contradiction doesn't threaten the story, it fuels it. Each version becomes a new branch, and the branches keep multiplying. What matters is not the original root, but how many communities find meaning in the figure they're shaping. Jesus behaves like an idea-first figure, not a biography-first figure, and the texts reflect that through their emphasis on interpretation and revelation, not recollection. If we imagine, just for a moment, that Jesus never existed, the entire historical puzzle suddenly makes more sense. The inconsistencies stop looking like sloppy reporting and start looking like creative storytelling. The contradictions stop appearing as errors and start appearing as the natural evolution of a mythic figure. The silence from early sources stops looking suspicious and starts looking predictable, and the rapid expansion of the religion stops being mysterious, because ideas spread far faster than biographies. This is not about dismissing anyone's beliefs. It's about taking the evidence seriously and asking a simple question: which explanation fits the data more cleanly? The idea of a real man whose life was poorly recorded, or the idea of a mythic figure whose story expanded over time? The more we look at it objectively, the more the second option fits what we actually see. And even if some people find that uncomfortable, exploring the possibility opens the door to understanding how stories shape us and how easily we mistake meaning for memory. When you pull all of this together, something becomes clear. The question isn't whether people today find meaning in the story. They obviously do. The question is whether the story began with a person or with an idea. History isn't asking anyone to abandon meaning. It's asking us to separate the emotional power of a narrative from the evidence that built it. If Jesus was a symbolic figure who later became treated as historical, that doesn't erase the impact the story has had. But it does change how we understand that impact. It shows how deeply humans need stories that promise justice, hope, and order in a chaotic world. It shows how easily a narrative can grow when people are looking for answers. And it shows how meaning can overshadow accuracy without anyone intending it to. Some people fear that questioning the historical existence of Jesus is an attack on their identity. But looking closely at the evidence isn't an attack. It's an act of curiosity. It's the same curiosity that pushes us to understand our world instead of settling for comfortable assumptions. And that curiosity is what keeps human knowledge moving forward. The idea that Jesus might not have existed is still shocking to many, not because the evidence is strong, but because the story is familiar. Familiarity feels like truth. Repetition feels like memory. But when we let ourselves ask the uncomfortable question, what if this story didn't begin with a real person? The pieces start falling into place in ways they never did before. We begin to see how easily a narrative can grow in a world where written records were rare and where people built meaning through symbols instead of documentation. We see how visions, interpretations, and theological debates shaped the earliest descriptions of Jesus long before anyone talked about physical details or eyewitness accounts. We see how different groups molded the character into whatever form best expressed their worldview. And we see how a symbolic figure can quietly transform into a historical one through the simple passage of time. In the end, whether Jesus existed or not doesn't change our responsibility to examine claims carefully, to look at the evidence instead of the comfort, to value truth more than tradition, and to understand that stories, no matter how meaningful, do not become history through belief alone. What makes this question worth asking is not the answer itself, but what it reveals about us. It shows how much we lean on narratives to give shape to our lives, how much we trust repetition instead of verification, and how easily myths can grow when they offer hope in places where reality feels harsh. If Jesus never existed, the story is still a fascinating window into how humans create meaning. If he did exist, the evidence we have doesn't take us close enough to know what he was like. Either way, the real insight comes from seeing how the story evolved, why it survived, and what needs it fulfilled along the way. And as we step back, one thing becomes clear. Sometimes the most powerful figures in history aren't individuals at all. They're ideas that took on a life of their own. Ideas shaped by hope, fear, uncertainty, and the desire for something bigger than ourselves. Ideas that grow until they feel real, even when the past refuses to confirm them. Asking whether Jesus existed isn't about tearing anything down. It's about understanding how stories rise, how belief spreads, and how meaning becomes memory. And once you see that process at work, you start recognizing it everywhere, in ancient myths, in modern movements, and in the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. When we follow the evidence honestly, without fear of where it leads, we find something deeper than certainty. We find clarity, a quiet understanding that truth doesn't need a sacred story to stand on its own, and that questioning the past doesn't weaken us. It strengthens us because it shows we value reality more than reassurance. And that's where this journey leaves us, not with a final answer, but with a better question, not with a dogma, but with a clearer view of the evidence, not with a closed door, but with a mindset that stays open to whatever the past really was. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need protection. It just needs to be looked at without fear. And sometimes the most honest thing we can do is simply say, we don't know. And that's exactly why we should keep asking.